Welcome again to George Washington Speaks. I'm Tom Saffold, introducing George Washington, the first president of the United States, portrayed by Vern Frykholm. In this edition of George Washington Speaks, we'll hear about Washington's parents and immediate family and the challenges Washington faced because he wasn't the privileged eldest son.
My father, Augustine, was born in 1694 at the Bridges Creek Plantation, and he died in 1743 at the age of 49 in Fredericksburg, Virginia. He was called Gus by his family and his close friends. He was a big, powerful man, and he was, like so many Washingtons before him, characteristically ambitious. Over time, he acquired more land and slaves to work the land and grew tobacco. He even built a grist mill that ground wheat into flour and corn into cornmeal that helped to feed the plantation. My father was Grandfather Lawrence's second son, and in spite of the common practice, he inherited a share of his father's estate when he died at age 38, and when my father was only 4 years old. In 1750, at age 21, my father Augustine married Jane Butler, who was the daughter of Caleb Butler of Westmoreland County, Virginia. Together they had 4 children, 2 of which died. He named his oldest son Lawrence after his father and gave his younger son his name, Augustine. Both boys were educated in England at Appleby School, a prominent school in northern England. His wife, Jane Butler, was born December 21st, 1699, and died November 1729 at the age of 30. Again, death was ever present and claimed Jane at an early age. Her cause of death was not known, but there were those who felt that it was probably because her lungs and breathing were affected, which was common along the waterways in the early winter time. However, it could have also been the consumption of bad food that had been improperly stored for winter or was improperly cooked. My father was much more interested in planting than his father was, and when he came of age, he started to buy more land around the Bridges Creek Plantation, eventually stretching it all the way to Pope's Creek. He built a new manor house closer to Pope Creek, which he started in 1722 when he was 26. It was a simple house, but it controlled a plantation of 1,300 acres with several outbuildings and 20 to 25 indentured servants and slaves. My father and his wife Jane moved into the new manor house in late 1726 or early 1727 with young Lawrence and Augustine. My father soon became one of the leading planters in the area and served as both the county sheriff and as the justice of peace in Westmoreland County Court. My father eventually purchased the Little Hunting Creek Plantation from his younger sister Mildred in 1726. However, he continued to live at the new manor home at Bridges Creek, and he renamed it the Pope Creek Plantation. After 9 years at the Pope's Creek Plantation home, my father's wife Jane died in 1731. 2 years later, he married my mother, Mary Ball Washington, and I was born 11 months afterwards. Elizabeth was born the following year, and Samuel the year after that. My mother and her brother George had been orphaned at an early age. My mother was 25 when she married my father, and she was considered to be old at that age, since most girls married in their mid to later teens. While my father had been living at Pope Creek with his first family, but after he purchased the Little Hunting Creek Plantation from his sister Mildred, he began adding acreage to the plantation. A year after he married my mother, he began to construct a modest home which consisted of 4 rooms and a central passage on the first floor. Later that year, he moved us to the Little Hunting Creek Plantation, where John and Charles were born. 4 years later, in 1738, we moved to the Ferry Farm, where Mildred, the youngest, was born. The Ferry Farm was across the Rappahannock River from the city of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and was near my father's iron ore furnace, which was located some 7 miles north on Accokeek River. I might note that although my father owned 2 plantations and the Ferry Farm, and even owned an interest in the Accokeek iron furnace, the family was by no means at the top of the social ladder. He was considered to be well off for a regional elite, but he was still in the lower gentry. The older families from England or from the first settlers in the colonies had a much longer pedigree and much more wealth. They primarily made up the upper gentry of the social class, and we Washingtons were still a long way away from entering that social strata. And yet in the colonies, it was obtainable with hard work and wise planning to rise in the social strata.
I hope you're beginning to understand George Washington better after watching these episodes. Remember, if you want to ask George Washington a question or invite him to your classroom, you can reach him through his website, georgewashingtonspeaks.com. The next episode tells more about his life growing up on the colonial farms and plantations.